At the beginning of the 1830s, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans lived on millions of acres of land in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida, the land their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. But by the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern United States. These Indians, who used to roam freely on their land, were forced to work on behalf of white settlers who wanted to grow cotton on the Indians' land. The federal government forced them to leave their homelands and walk thousands of miles to specially designated areas, or Indian Territory, across the Mississippi River.
It all started as what the white settlers called the Indian problem. White settlers, particularly those who lived on the western frontier, feared and resented the Native Americans they encountered. To them, American Indians were savage, alien people who occupied land that white settlers wanted. Some officials in the early years of the American Republic, such as President George Washington, believed that the best way to solve this Indian problem was simply to civilize the Native Americans. The goal of this civilization campaign was to make Native Americans as much like white Americans as possible, by encouraging them to convert to Christianity, learn to speak and read English, and adopt European-style economic practices such as the individual ownership of land and other properties.
But eventually, the white settlers grew greedy for the land. Their goal was not just to convert the ways of the Indians now. They wanted to take away their property. Eventually, the government even joined in to drive Native Americans out of their land. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson began the concept of Indian removal as Indians were forced to relinquish their lands east of the Mississippi River in exchange for lands to the west. Another leader, Andrew Jackson, was also a strong advocate of Indian removal. As president, he continued this crusade. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government the power to exchange native-held land in the areas east of the Mississippi River for land to the west, in the Indian Colonization Zone. This is the zone the United States had acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase.
Five major Indian nations were affected by this act: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muscogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes. Some nations attempted to fight back as a means to save their land. The Seminoles would wage 3 wars with the white settlers in just a few years. These wars resulted in thousands of deaths, especially on the Native American side. Instead of initiating warfare, however, the Cherokee Indians actually took Georgia to court. This trial eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall eventually ruled that the Cherokee did not have to move. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decisions in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia proved inadequate to protect Native Americans in the face of state, presidential, and congressional opposition. Andrew Jackson was able to, ultimately, force them off their land. The removal of the Cherokee came to be known as the Trail of Tears, as 4,000 people died on the way.
events that led to the Indian removal leave a dramatic effect in the history of America. Up to this day, a majority of Native Americans live in poverty, surrounded by some of the poorest neighborhoods. Many are often uneducated and as a result are isolated from the rest of society. Among these natives, mortality, suicide, and alcoholism are extremely high. Less than 2 centuries ago, Native Americans freely roamed America. Today, they make up less than 2% of the population. The Indian removal remains one of the most prominent weaknesses in American history.